December 15th, 1943. The frigid winds swept across the Belgian countryside, howling through the skeletal remains of once flourishing villages. Corporal Thomas Hayes of the United States Army Medical Corps trudged through ankle-deep mud, his medical bag clutched tightly against his chest. The young medic believed he was simply following orders to evacuate wounded personnel from an overrun aid station. He had no way of knowing that the injured nurse he would soon rescue would fundamentally alter the course of his life in ways he could never imagine. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable tale of how a single act of compassion during the darkest days of the conflict would create a thread of connection that would stretch across time and continents, eventually bringing two strangers full circle in a moment when past kindnesses would be repaid in the most unexpected way. The winter of 1943 had been particularly brutal in Belgium. Snow had fallen early that year, blanketing the countryside in a deceptive shroud of white that concealed the horrors beneath. For 22-year-old Corporal Thomas Hayes, the cold had become his constant companion. Originally from sunny California, he had never experienced temperatures this low. The son of a prominent physician, Thomas had volunteered for the Medical Corps immediately after completing his pre-medical studies at Stanford University. His father had served in the previous conflict, and Thomas felt a duty to uphold the family tradition of healing. "For your fingers always give out before your heart does," his commanding officer, Major Wilson, had told him during training. "Remember that when you're out there." Those words echoed in Thomas's mind as he flexed his stiffening fingers inside his gloves. The December air bit through the wool, but he refused to lose dexterity by wearing anything thicker. A medic with numb hands was useless. "Hayes, pick up the pace," called Lieutenant Robert Anderson from several yards ahead. "We've got 6 kilometers to cover before sunset." The small rescue team consisted of just 4 men: Lieutenant Anderson, Corporal Hayes, Private First Class Miller, and Private Jackson. They had been dispatched to retrieve any surviving medical personnel from Aid Station 42, which had been caught behind the shifting front lines after an unexpected German advance. "Intelligence reports indicate the station was abandoned yesterday," Anderson continued, consulting his map. "But there's a chance some personnel remained with patients too wounded to move." Thomas adjusted the strap of his medical bag and quickened his pace. "Any word on how many staff might be there, sir?" 3 doctors, 5 nurses, and approximately 12 enlisted medics were assigned to the station, Anderson replied. "Most likely evacuated with the ambulance convoy, but radio contact was lost before confirmation." The small team moved carefully through the forest, avoiding open ground whenever possible. Though this area had been declared relatively secure by intelligence officers, the fluidity of the front lines meant danger could arise at any moment. After 3 hours of hiking, they reached a ridge overlooking a small valley. Through his binoculars, Thomas could see the aid station, a farmhouse with a prominent red cross painted on its roof. The building appeared intact, but there was no sign of activity. "Seems abandoned," Lieutenant Anderson muttered, "but we'll approach with caution." They descended the ridge in a staggered formation, weapons at the ready. Though Medical Corps personnel, they were still soldiers in a conflict zone. As they drew closer, Thomas noticed faint smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney. "Someone's still there," he whispered. Lieutenant Anderson signaled for them to spread out and approach from different angles. Thomas circled around to the rear of the building, where he found a small garden now covered in snow. The back door stood slightly ajar. With his sidearm drawn, Thomas pushed the door open. "American Medical Corps," he called out. "Is anyone here?" The silence that greeted him was broken only by the creaking of the old farmhouse boards. The kitchen was a mess of abandoned supplies and hastily discarded equipment, evidence of a rushed evacuation. Thomas moved carefully through to the main part of the house. The front room had been converted into a treatment area with 6 makeshift cots arranged in rows. All were empty except for one in the corner, where a figure lay beneath a pile of blankets. Thomas approached cautiously, noting the slow rise and fall of the blankets that indicated breathing. "Hello? I'm Corporal Hayes, American Medical Corps. We're here to evacuate you." The blankets shifted, and a woman's face appeared. pale, drawn, with striking blue eyes that seemed too large for her gaunt face. Her blonde hair was matted with sweat, and a hasty bandage wrapped around her forehead showed spots of dried blood. "Lieutenant Catherine Bennett, Army Nurse Corps," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone else left yesterday. I told them to go." Thomas immediately set down his bag and began assessing her condition. "Why didn't you go with them, Lieutenant?" A weak smile crossed her face. "My ankle, broken, I think. The ambulances were full of critical patients. I volunteered to stay behind with 4 injured men who could still walk with assistance. They helped each other but couldn't carry me." She paused, wincing as Thomas gently examined her leg. "We expected another evacuation team within hours." "And the men who were with you?" "Left at dawn. A patrol came through and said they could escort the walking wounded, but couldn't wait for a stretcher team for me." She closed her eyes briefly. "I ordered them to go. No sense in 5 people being captured instead of just 1. Thomas called for the lieutenant and the others, who quickly joined him inside. While Anderson radioed their position, Thomas conducted a more thorough examination of Nurse Bennett. "Fractured right ankle, moderate concussion, dehydration and early signs of hypothermia," he reported. "She needs immediate evacuation." Private Jackson produced a collapsible stretcher from his pack, and they carefully transferred Catherine onto it. As they prepared to depart, Thomas noticed her shivering intensify. "Hold on," he said, removing his outer coat and laying it over her. "You need this more than I do." "You'll freeze," she protested weakly. "I'll manage. California blood runs hot," he joked, though he was already feeling the bite of the December air through his remaining layers. As they began the journey back to their lines, Catherine drifted in and out of consciousness. During her lucid moments, Thomas learned she was from Boston, had been a nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital before the war, and had volunteered for overseas duty immediately after Pearl Harbor. "My fiancé was a sailor," she explained during one alert period. "He was at Pearl, on the Arizona." Thomas understood the implication. The Arizona had been sunk with terrible loss of life. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I couldn't just stay home after that," she continued. "Not when I had skills that could help." The journey back was arduous. The temperature dropped further as evening approached, and the stretcher-bearers struggled in the increasingly slippery conditions. Thomas walked alongside Catherine, monitoring her condition and occasionally administering sips of water. At one point, they heard distant artillery fire, and Lieutenant Anderson ordered them to take cover in a small grove of trees. "The lines must have shifted again," he muttered, consulting his map. "We need to adjust our route." The detour added 2 hours to their journey. By the time darkness fell, Thomas was shivering uncontrollably, having given his coat to Catherine. His fingers had gone from painful to worryingly numb. "You need your coat back," Catherine said, noticing his condition despite her own discomfort. "And undo all my good work keeping you warm?" "Not a chance, Lieutenant," Thomas replied, forcing cheer into his voice. Private Miller, observing this exchange, removed his scarf and handed it to Thomas. "Take this, Doc. Can't have our medic freezing to death." The small act of kindness from Miller touched Thomas deeply. Throughout his deployment, he had witnessed countless small gestures of humanity amid the overwhelming inhumanity of war. Those moments sustained him more than any letter from home. Around midnight, they finally reached the American lines and were quickly directed to the new field hospital that had been established 5 kilometers behind the front. Catherine was immediately taken for treatment, while Thomas, now exhibiting signs of mild hypothermia himself, was ordered to rest. "Thank you, Corporal," Catherine called as she was wheeled away. "I won't forget this." Thomas managed a smile and a small salute before collapsing onto a cot in the medical staff quarters. The next morning, he awoke to find his coat folded neatly at the foot of his bed, along with a note. "Borrowed this when I needed it most. Hope to return the favor someday. Lieutenant Bennett." He visited her briefly before being assigned to his next duties. She was looking considerably better, with color returned to her cheeks. Her ankle had been properly set, and the doctors expected a full recovery, though she would be evacuated to England for proper convalescence. "They're sending me back to London tomorrow," and she told him, "then probably home after that." "That's good news," Thomas said, genuinely pleased for her while feeling a strange disappointment that their paths would diverge so soon. "What about you? Where are they sending you next?" "Wherever they need medics, I suppose," he replied with a shrug. "That's the life we chose." Before they parted, Catherine insisted on taking down his home address in California. "When this is all over, I'd like to write to you, let you know how I'm doing." Thomas hesitated only briefly before providing his parents' address in San Francisco. He had made many acquaintances during the war, but had been cautious about forming attachments. Something about Catherine's quiet determination, however, had resonated with him. The following day she was gone, evacuated with a group of wounded to a hospital ship bound for England. Thomas continued his duties as a field medic, moving from one battlefront to another as the Allied forces pushed steadily eastward. In April of 1944, while treating wounded near the German border, Thomas was caught in an artillery barrage. Shrapnel tore through his left leg, severing an artery. Were it not for the quick action of another medic, he would have bled to death within minutes. The injury ended his front-line service. After emergency surgery and stabilization, Thomas was evacuated to England, then to a military hospital in New York. By the summer of '44, he had been discharged with a Purple Heart and a permanent limp. Thomas returned to California, resuming his medical studies at Stanford with a new perspective on both medicine and human fragility. The war had changed him, as it had changed everyone who experienced it firsthand. He found himself drawn to emergency medicine, his wartime experiences having prepared him for the high-pressure environment of trauma care. Throughout his recovery and return to civilian life, Thomas often thought of the nurse he had rescued in Belgium. He had received one letter from her, postmarked from London in January '44, thanking him again and expressing hope that he remained safe. He had replied, but as the chaotic war continued, their correspondence had not. Life moved forward. Thomas completed medical school, undertook his residency, and eventually joined a growing hospital in Sacramento. By 1949, he had established himself as a respected emergency physician, known for his steady hands and calm demeanor in crisis situations. The Korean conflict brought a new wave of casualties and a renewed sense of purpose for many medical professionals. Though his injury prevented him from returning to military service, Thomas volunteered his expertise at veterans' hospitals, training new doctors in techniques he had learned both on the battlefield and in the years since. It was during one such training session at Oak Knoll Naval Hospital in Oakland, in the autumn of 1951, that Thomas encountered a familiar face. He was demonstrating a new approach to triage when he noticed a woman observing from the doorway. A nursing supervisor, judging by her uniform. Something about her struck him as familiar, though he couldn't immediately place her. After the demonstration concluded, she approached him. "Your techniques have improved since Belgium, Corporal Hayes," she said with a small smile. Recognition dawned immediately. "Lieutenant Bennett," he replied, breaking into a grin. "Though I suppose it's not Lieutenant anymore." "Head Nurse Bennett now," she corrected. "Or Catherine, preferably." They found themselves in the hospital cafeteria an hour later, catching up on the years that had passed. Catherine had remained in the Army Nurse Corps until 1947, serving in hospitals across Europe during the final stages of the war and the immediate aftermath. "I was in Paris when it ended," she explained. "The celebrations were unlike anything I've ever experienced. People dancing in the streets, hugging complete strangers. I was considerably less exotic," Thomas admitted, sitting in a classroom in Palo Alto, trying to remember biochemistry instead of field medicine. Catherine laughed, still saving lives, just in a different setting. She had returned to Boston after her discharge, but had found the city too full of memories. When an opportunity arose to join the staff at Oak Knoll, she had relocated to California. "And you?" she asked. "Did you ever return to Europe?" Thomas shook his head. "No. Between medical school and the residency, there hasn't been time for much travel. Someday, perhaps." Their conversation flowed easily, as if the years between their brief encounter in Belgium and this unexpected reunion had dissolved. Thomas found himself captivated by the confident, accomplished woman Catherine had become, so different from the injured nurse he had helped evacuate. Before they parted, they arranged to meet for dinner the following weekend. That dinner led to another, and soon they were seeing each other regularly. 6 months later, Thomas proposed, and Catherine accepted. Their wedding was a small affair, attended by medical colleagues and a few friends from their respective service days. Thomas's parents hosted the reception in their San Francisco home, welcoming Catherine warmly into their family. The newlyweds settled in Oakland, with Thomas commuting to his position in Sacramento 3 days a week and working at a local hospital the remaining time. Catherine continued her supervisory role at Oak Knoll, where her expertise was increasingly valued as the Korean casualties mounted. Life settled into a comfortable routine, their shared experiences in medicine and war creating a bond that few could understand. They discussed starting a family, though both agreed to wait until their careers were more established. In the spring of 1953, Thomas began experiencing unexplained fatigue and shortness of breath. Initially, he dismissed these symptoms as the result of overwork and stress. Catherine, however, insisted he undergo a thorough examination. The diagnosis was devastating: myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart muscle, likely the result of a viral infection. Thomas's condition deteriorated rapidly, and within weeks he was hospitalized at the very facility where he had once been a respected physician. Catherine took a leave of absence to remain by his side. Her nursing experience made her acutely aware of the gravity of his condition. Thomas's heart was failing, and the medical treatments available at the time were limited. "You need to prepare yourself," Dr. Martin, the cardiologist, told Catherine privately. "His heart is severely damaged. Without a miracle, he has perhaps 6 months." Catherine refused to accept this prognosis. She began researching experimental treatments, contacting specialists across the country, and advocating fiercely for her husband's care. It was during this desperate search that Catherine remembered a cardiac surgeon she had worked with briefly in London, Dr. James Richardson. He had been pioneering new surgical techniques for heart repair and had recently relocated to Boston. Without hesitation, Catherine placed a long-distance call to Massachusetts General Hospital. "Dr. Richardson," she said when he came to the phone, "this is Catherine Bennett. Hayes now, we worked together in London in '44. "Nurse Bennett, of course I remember you," came the warm reply, one of the few who could anticipate my needs in surgery before I knew them myself. Catherine quickly explained Thomas's condition. "The doctors here say there's nothing more they can do, but I remembered your work with valve repair." There was a pause on the line. "Catherine, those procedures are still highly experimental. The success rate is," he hesitated, "not encouraging. But there is a chance?" Another pause. "Yes, a small one. But the patient would need to be strong enough to withstand major surgery. And the damage would need to be specifically located in areas we can access. Would you at least review his case? Please, James. He's everything to me." Dr. Richardson agreed to examine Thomas's medical records. Within days, he had reviewed the files and called Catherine back. "It's a long shot," he admitted, "but there are aspects of his case that align with the parameters of my research. If you can get him to Boston, I'm willing to attempt the procedure." The logistics were daunting. Thomas was too ill to travel commercially, and a medical transport across the country would be prohibitively expensive. Once again, Catherine's wartime connections proved invaluable. A former flight nurse now working with the Military Air Transport Service arranged for Thomas to be included on a medical evacuation flight heading east. Catherine accompanied him, monitoring his condition throughout the journey. Upon their arrival in Boston, Thomas was immediately admitted to Massachusetts General Hospital. Richardson conducted his own examination and confirmed his initial assessment. "The damage is extensive," he told them, "but localized in a way that might respond to my technique. I must emphasize the experimental nature of this procedure." Thomas, weak but still lucid, managed a smile. "As a fellow doctor, I understand the risks. As a patient, I'm out of options." Catherine held his hand tightly. "We trust you, James." The surgery was scheduled for the following morning. That night, Catherine stayed by Thomas's bedside, reminiscing about their first meeting in Belgium. "Do you remember how cold it was?" she asked, stroking his hair. "And you gave me your coat even though you were freezing yourself." Best decision I ever made, Thomas murmured. Led me to you. You saved my life that day, Catherine said softly. Tomorrow I'm returning the favor. The surgery lasted 9 hours. Dr. Richardson, assisted by a team that included Catherine in a supporting role, repaired Thomas's damaged heart valve, using a technique he had developed through years of research and careful trial. The procedure was groundbreaking, a predecessor to operations that would become standard decades later. For Thomas Hayes, it represented his only chance at survival. When it was over, Dr. Richardson appeared cautiously optimistic. We've done all we can. The rest depends on his own strength and will to recover. The following days were tense. Thomas remained unconscious, his repaired heart struggling to adapt to its new configuration. Catherine rarely left his side, monitoring every change in his condition with the expertise of both a trained nurse and a devoted wife. On the 4th day post-surgery, Thomas opened his eyes. His first words were barely audible. Did it work? Catherine, who had been dozing in a chair beside his bed, was immediately alert. Yes, she whispered, tears flowing freely. It worked. Thomas's recovery was slow but steady. By autumn, he had regained enough strength to return to California, though his days as an emergency physician were over. Instead, he turned to teaching and research, sharing his unique perspective as both doctor and patient with new generations of medical students. Catherine resumed her position at Oak Knoll, eventually becoming Director of Nursing. Together, they established a foundation to support medical research, focusing particularly on cardiac care for veterans. In the decades that followed, Thomas and Catherine watched as many of the experimental procedures that had saved his life became routine operations. The medical landscape transformed, incorporating technologies and techniques they could scarcely have imagined during their wartime service. They never had children of their own, but their legacy lived on through the hundreds of medical professionals they mentored and the countless lives saved through their foundation's work. On December 15th, 1983, exactly 40 years after their first meeting in Belgium, Thomas and Catherine Hayes returned to Europe. Despite his age and the lingering effects of his heart condition, Thomas had insisted on making the journey. They stood together in the peaceful Belgian countryside, now showing no visible scars from the conflict that had once ravaged it. The farmhouse that had served as Aid Station 42 was gone, replaced by a modern home with a well-tended garden. It looks so different, Catherine murmured, leaning against Thomas's arm. So normal. The land heals, Thomas replied, just as people do. They had come full circle, from a chance encounter amid the chaos of war to a lifetime shared in service to others. What had begun as a simple act of compassion, a young medic giving his coat to a wounded nurse, had initiated a chain of events neither could have foreseen. Later that evening, in their Brussels hotel, Catherine found Thomas standing by the window, gazing at the city lights. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, joining him. "About how uncertain life is," he replied. "How one small decision can change everything. If our paths hadn't crossed again at Oak Knoll." "They would have crossed somewhere else," Catherine said firmly. "Some connections are meant to be." Thomas smiled and took her hand. "The scientist in me wants to attribute it all to coincidence and probability. And what does the rest of you say?" He considered this for a moment. "That some debts are meant to be repaid. You said it yourself the night before my surgery. I saved your life in Belgium, and years later, you saved mine." "We saved each other," Catherine corrected gently. "And we've been doing it ever since." As they stood together looking out over the peaceful city that had once been at the center of a global conflict, they embodied a truth often overlooked in historical accounts of war, that amid the grand strategies and massive battles, individual acts of kindness and connection could echo through time, creating ripples that extended far beyond the moment they occurred. Their story, from a desperate evacuation in 1943 to a life-saving surgery a decade later, demonstrated how the chaos of war could occasionally yield unexpected blessings. For Thomas and Catherine Hayes, what began as duty became destiny, proving that even in humanity's darkest hours, the capacity for compassion and connection remained undiminished. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.